You don't belong here anymore, but you're going to a care facility. Enough.
The word landed before the silence did. Yura Shin's hand froze in the air. Not halfway. Not unsure. Just stopped. Like something had interrupted more than her movement. Something had interrupted her control. For a second. No one moved. Not Yura. Not the old man struggling to breathe through the weight of what he just heard. Not even the room itself. Because that word wasn't supposed to come from where it did. Yura turned slowly. Not angry. Not yet. Confused. Because standing there, between her decision and the man she had already dismissed, was a cleaner. Still. Quiet. Unapologetic. Alric Fenlow's fingers tightened around his cane. Not to stand. Not to fight. Just to stay present long enough to understand what was happening. Because no one had ever stopped her before. No one had ever chosen him before. Yura's eyes narrowed slightly. You said something? She asked. Soft. Controlled. Dangerous. But the woman didn't move. Didn't explain. Didn't retreat. She just stood there. Like the word she said was already enough. And somehow, it was. If you were in that room, would you have stayed quiet? Or said that one word? Be honest. Because not everyone gets the courage to speak. Drop it in the comments. I want to know what you would do. And if this already has your attention, like, share, and subscribe. Because this story only gets deeper from here. By the time the front door opened that evening, the house had already changed. Not in structure. Not in sound. But in performance. Welcome home, Yura Shin said warmly, her voice softer now, almost gentle. She moved quickly, too quickly, to take the coat from her husband's shoulders, her smile effortless, practiced. You're late, she added lightly, brushing invisible dust from his sleeve. You've been working too hard again. He exhaled, tired but reassured by the familiarity of it all. It's been a long day, he admitted. I can imagine, Yura replied, guiding him toward the living area. Don't worry about anything here. I've taken care of everything. Everything. The word sat comfortably in the air. Too comfortably. Alric Fenlow sat in his usual place, hands resting over his cane, posture slightly straighter than before, as if trying to match the version of himself that existed in Yura's words. Father, the man greeted, stepping closer. How are you feeling today? A pause. Just a second too long. I'm all right, Alric said. Yura stepped in smoothly, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He's been much better today, she said with a soft smile. I made sure he ate properly, and he even walked a little more than usual. Her tone carried care. Convincing. Effortless. Her husband nodded, visibly relieved. That's good. That's really good. He didn't see the way Alric's fingers tightened slightly around the cane. Didn't notice the hesitation behind the words. Because everything he needed to believe was being handed to him. I've also been looking into additional support, Yura continued, her voice calm, thoughtful. Just in case we need it in the future. Whatever you think is best, he said without hesitation. And just like that, the decision wasn't his anymore. From the corner of the room, unnoticed, Anira Solace stood quietly beside her bucket. Watching. Not the words, but the spaces between them. Because the truth wasn't in what Yura said. It was in what Alric didn't. The door clicked shut. Not loudly. Just enough to signal that the performance was over. Yura stood still for a moment, listening to the fading sound of her husband's footsteps down the hallway. Waiting. Measuring. Then her shoulders lowered. Not with relief. With release. When she turned, the softness was gone. What was that? She asked, her voice no longer warm, no longer patient. Alric didn't answer immediately. His hands rested on his cane, his eyes fixed somewhere just below her gaze. I asked you something, she said, stepping closer. Or have you started ignoring me now? I didn't mean to pause, he replied quietly. I was just Slow. She finished for him, tilting her head slightly. Yes, I noticed. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They landed where they were meant to. You make everything harder than it needs to be, she continued, brushing past him toward the table. Simple questions, simple answers. It shouldn't be this exhausting. Alric swallowed, his grip tightening slightly. I said I was all right. And I corrected you, Yura replied calmly. Because clearly you're not. She adjusted a glass on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge, as if restoring order. You hesitated, she added. In front of him. A pause. That makes things inconvenient. Alric's lips parted, but no words followed. Because he understood. This wasn't about concern. It was about control. You will not contradict me, she said softly, her back still turned. Not directly. Not indirectly. Not even with silence. She turned again, her expression composed, almost thoughtful. I work very hard to keep things running smoothly in this house, she continued. The least you can do is not disrupt that. Her eyes moved briefly to the cane. Then back to him. And try not to look so helpless when he's around, she added. It sends the wrong message. Alric lowered his gaze. Not in agreement. Just in surrender. Because sometimes, the quietest words cut the deepest. Days passed without announcement. Nothing dramatic changed. No arguments. No raised voices. No visible harm. And yet, something was disappearing. Alric Fenlow began to move differently. Slower than before. Not because his legs had worsened, but because he had learned that every extra step drew attention. So he took fewer. He spoke less too. At first, it was hesitation. Then it became choice. Simple questions were met with shorter answers. Sometimes just a nod. Sometimes nothing at all. Because words, he had realized, often led somewhere he didn't want to go. Correction. Irritation. That quiet shift in Yura's tone that made everything feel like a mistake. So he reduced them. Until silence felt safer. Meals became quieter. He waited until the room was empty before reaching for anything, careful not to drop a spoon, not to shift a chair, not to create a sound that could be noticed. Even his breathing changed. Measured. Contained. As if taking up less space might somehow make him less of a problem. The cane stayed close. Not just for support, but as something to hold onto when everything else felt uncertain. Sometimes he would sit longer than necessary, even when standing was possible. Because standing meant moving. And moving meant being seen. And being seen meant being evaluated. Across the room, life continued as normal. Phones rang. Footsteps passed. Doors opened and closed. But Alric existed just outside of it now. Present, but not included. There were moments when he would look toward the doorway, as if expecting something. A question. A conversation. A sign that he was still part of the room. But nothing came. And slowly, without anyone announcing it, he adjusted. Not to comfort. Not to healing. But to absence. Until the man who once filled a space began to fit inside it quietly. And eventually, almost disappeared. The calls always came at the same time. Late enough for the house to be quiet. Early enough for concern to sound believable. I think we should increase his support, Yura said one evening, her voice softened just enough to carry weight. He's been struggling more than usual. She stood near the window, phone pressed gently to her ear, gaze distant, composed, thoughtful. On the other end, her husband sighed. I thought things were getting better. They were, she replied quickly. But you know how it is at his age. Some days are harder. A pause. I don't want him to feel neglected. The word lingered. Neglected. Carefully chosen. Perfectly placed. How much do you need? He asked. Yura didn't hesitate. I'll send you the details, she said. Medication, assistance, a few adjustments around the house. It adds up. Do whatever is necessary, he replied. Just make sure he's comfortable. Comfortable. Yura's expression didn't change. Of course, she said softly. When the call ended, the warmth left with it. She lowered the phone, her posture shifting back into something quieter, sharper. Across the room, Alric sat where he always did. Hands folded. Cane resting against his leg. Waiting without knowing what for. Yura glanced at him briefly. Not with concern. With calculation. You should be grateful, she said, placing the phone down with deliberate care. Not everyone would go this far. Alric nodded faintly. Because it seemed expected. Because anything else felt risky. I'm trying, he said quietly. Yura adjusted a cushion on the sofa, aligning it precisely. Try harder, she replied. There was no anger in it. No raised tone. Just a quiet insistence that settled heavily in the space between them. Later, when food was placed before him, it was just out of reach. Not enough to notice immediately. Just enough to require effort. Alric leaned forward slowly, his hand trembling as he reached. The plate shifted slightly. Yura watched. Said nothing. And somewhere between what was given and what was withheld, the difference became clear. Care was being funded, but dignity was not included. Anira Solace learned the rhythm of the house long before she understood its silence. It lived in small patterns. The way Yura's voice softened when the phone rang. The way it changed when it ended. The careful placement of things just beyond reach. The pauses that followed simple questions. None of it was loud. That was the point. Anira moved through it quietly, her steps measured, her presence easy to ignore. The bucket rolled softly beside her, water shifting with each turn, the faint scent of soap lingering in the air. She cleaned what could be seen, and noticed what wasn't meant to be. Alric Fenlow rarely looked at her directly. Not out of disregard. But because he had learned to keep his gaze low, his movements contained, his presence minimal. Still, there were moments. A glance that lingered too long. A hand that trembled just before reaching. A breath held for no clear reason. Moments that said more than words ever could. Anira saw them all. And she remembered. Not this house. Not these people. But the feeling. Of watching something unfold that should have been stopped. Of knowing exactly when it crossed the line, and choosing not to step in. At the time, silence had felt like safety. Now it felt like something else. Yura passed by her one afternoon, heels steady, expression composed. You missed a spot, she said lightly, gesturing toward the floor without breaking stride. Anira nodded once. Of course, she replied. Her voice was even. Respectful. Unremarkable. Exactly what was expected. She corrected the spot. Adjusted the angle. Moved on. Because that was her role. To be present. But not involved. And yet, each day, the distance between what she saw and what she allowed grew thinner. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just, steadily. Until silence no longer felt neutral. Until doing nothing began to feel like a choice. And somewhere beneath the routine, beneath the quiet, beneath the practiced restraint, something shifted. Not in the room. Not in the house. But in her. And for the first time since she arrived, Anira Solace began to wonder how long she could keep watching. Without saying anything at all. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. No raised voices. No sudden movement. Just a decision spoken too calmly to be mistaken for anything else. You're leaving next week. Yura Shin didn't look at him when she said it. She stood near the table, flipping through a small folder, her tone measured, almost administrative. I've finalized everything, she added. The facility is ready to take you. Alric Fenlow's hand tightened slowly around his cane. Next week, he repeated, the words catching slightly. Yura glanced up briefly, then back down. It's for the best, she said. You'll have proper care. Structure. People trained to handle your condition. A pause. And it will make things easier here. The last sentence settled differently. Not for him. For her. Alric shifted in his seat, the effort visible in the small movement. I can manage, he said quietly. I don't take up much space. Yura closed the folder. That's not the point. Her eyes moved to him now, steady, detached. You hesitate when you speak. You move slowly. You require attention at inconvenient times. Each word was placed carefully. Not harsh. Just exact. This house runs on precision, she continued. And you disrupt that. Alric lowered his gaze, his fingers pressing faintly into the handle of the cane as if anchoring himself. I'll try to do better, he said. Yura's expression didn't change. This isn't about trying. She stepped closer, her presence controlled, composed. It's about placement, she added. And you're no longer suited to this one. Silence followed. Not tense. Not uncertain. Final. Alric's lips parted slightly, but nothing came out. Because somewhere between being told he was a burden and being moved like one, he realized something else. This wasn't care. This wasn't concern. This wasn't even a difficult decision. It was simple. He had become inconvenient. Across the room, the faint sound of water shifting in a bucket paused for just a second, then continued. But something in the air had already changed. Because this time, it wasn't implied. It was decided. And there was no space left for him to remain. The words didn't leave the room. They followed her. Softly at first. Then louder with each step. You're leaving next week. Anira's hands moved automatically, cloth passing over a surface that didn't need cleaning. The motion was steady, practiced. But her mind had already gone somewhere else. A different room. Smaller. Dimmer. The smell of medicine that never quite faded. There had been a chair by the window. And a woman who rarely left it. Not because she couldn't. But because no one waited for her to. Anira had been younger then. Quieter in a different way. Still learning how to stay out of things that felt too heavy to carry. Just give her time, someone had said. She's difficult. Difficult. The word had been used often. Softly. Reasonably. Like an explanation. Like a justification. Anira remembered standing in the doorway, hearing the same tone she heard now. The same careful patience that hid something colder beneath it. She had noticed the small things then too. The untouched food. The unanswered questions. The way the woman's voice grew thinner each day, as if speaking required permission. And she had done nothing. Not because she didn't see, but because she told herself it wasn't her place. Someone else would handle it. Someone closer. Someone responsible. But no one did. Weeks passed. Then silence. Not the kind that fills a room. The kind that replaces someone in it. Anira never forgot the last time she saw her. The way her eyes held onto something unspoken. Not anger. Not blame. Just a quiet question that never found its way out. Why didn't you say anything? The cloth in Anira's hand stopped moving. Just for a moment. Then continued. Because the past couldn't be changed. But it didn't leave either. It stayed. In moments like this. In decisions not yet made. In lines that appeared quietly. Before they were crossed. And as the house settled back into its usual silence, Anira realized something she hadn't allowed herself to before. Silence wasn't neutral. It had a direction. And once chosen, it had a cost. You're going to be ready by Monday. Yura Shin adjusted the papers in her hand as she spoke, her tone even, almost considerate. I've arranged transportation. You won't need to worry about anything. Alric Fenlow sat very still. Not resisting. Not agreeing. Just absorbing. I don't want to go, he said, his voice barely holding. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. Yura exhaled softly, as if the response had been expected and already dismissed. This isn't about what you want, she replied. It's about what makes sense. Her gaze moved past him briefly, scanning the room as though everything were already in order. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. Alric's fingers tightened around the cane. Not to stand. Just to remain. I can stay out of the way, he said quietly. I won't be a problem. Yura's expression didn't shift. You already are. The words settled without force. That was what made them final. A small movement followed, her hand lifting slightly, not to strike, but to end the conversation. A gesture of closure. Decision made. Across the room, water stilled. The cloth in Anira's hand slowed, then stopped. There was a moment, brief, almost unnoticeable, where nothing moved. Not because time had paused, but because something within it had. The memory lingered. The doorway. The silence. The question that was never answered. And then, Anira stepped forward. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Enough. The word didn't rise. It didn't echo. It didn't demand attention. And yet, it took it. Yura's hand remained where it was. But the gesture no longer meant what it had a second ago. Because for the first time, it wasn't the final word. Yura turned slowly, her eyes settling on Anira with measured disbelief. What did you say? Anira met her gaze. Not challenging. Not apologizing. Just present. Enough, she repeated. And in that repetition, there was no anger. No hesitation. Only the weight of everything that had gone unspoken before. Alric looked up. Not fully. Just enough to see. Because something had shifted. Not in the room. But in the balance of it. And once that balance moved, it didn't return the same. Yura Shin did not speak immediately. She looked at Anira the way one studies something unexpected. Quietly, carefully, as if waiting for it to correct itself. It didn't. The room held its breath. Not in fear. In adjustment. Because something that had always been understood without words had just been questioned. Out loud. You're overstepping, Yura said finally, her voice low, controlled. Not raised. Refined. The kind of tone that had always been enough. But this time, it didn't land the same. Anira didn't move. Didn't lower her gaze. Didn't apologize. She simply stood where she was, as though the space she occupied had already been decided. I'm doing my job, she said. The words were simple. Unadorned. But they stayed. Yura's expression shifted slightly. Not anger. Not yet. Recognition. Of something unfamiliar. Most people reacted to her presence. Adjusted themselves. Smoothed their tone. Stepped back without being asked. Anira had done none of that. You clean, Yura replied, a faint edge threading through her calm. That's your job. Anira's gaze didn't waver. And he lives here, she said. A pause. He's not something to be moved. The silence that followed was different. Heavier. Not because of what was said, but because of what it refused to bend to. Yura took a small step forward. Measured. Intentional. Closing the distance just enough to reassert what had always worked before. Be careful, she said quietly. You're forgetting your place. Anira didn't step back. Didn't match the movement. Didn't respond immediately. Because this wasn't about position. It was about presence. And for the first time, Yura felt it. Not resistance. Not confrontation. Something steadier. Something that didn't rely on volume or status. Something that simply didn't move. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Because power, when it's expected to be followed, doesn't know what to do when it isn't. And in that moment, Yura realized something she hadn't before. This wasn't someone she could silence. Because silence had already been refused. Alric Fenlow did not become stronger. His hands still trembled. His steps were still slow. The cane remained a necessity, not a choice. But something within him shifted. Not in his body. In his place. Because for the first time in a long while, He was no longer being reduced. No longer being adjusted to fit someone else's convenience. He was seen. And sometimes, that is all the strength a person needs. Yura Shin did not collapse. She did not raise her voice or create a scene. But something far more significant happened. She was no longer unquestioned. The quiet authority she carried, built on assumption, on control, on silence, no longer held the same weight. Because once someone speaks, once someone refuses to look away, control begins to slip. Not loudly, but steadily. And Anira Solace? She did not step forward as a hero. She did not demand recognition or gratitude. She simply chose not to repeat the same silence that once cost her something she could never take back. She corrected it. With one word. And in doing so, she changed more than a moment. She restored something that had been quietly taken. Dignity. Because the truth is, people like Alric do not need to be reminded of their weakness. Life has already done that. What they need is something else. Warmth. Patience. Presence. They are not burdens. They are the same hands that once carried, the same voices that once guided, the same strength that once protected. And now that strength has changed form. It lives in memory, in experience, in quiet endurance. The roles have simply shifted. And where they once stood for us, we are now meant to stand for them. Not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Because care is not measured by convenience. And love is not proven in comfort alone. It is revealed in how we treat those who can no longer give us anything in return. Some people grow old and become invisible. Not because they disappear, but because the world stops looking. And sometimes, it only takes one person to see them again. If this story stayed with you, take a moment. When last did you check on an elderly person in your life? Not out of duty, but out of love. Drop a comment and tell me, how do you show care to the elderly around you? And if this message means something to you, type, I will do better in the comments. Because sometimes, change doesn't start with big actions. It starts with awareness. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters. And wherever you're watching from, you are appreciated.